Welcome to the third lecture this week, and today we'll be discussing how experts affect cities. In the beginning of the week, we talked about how people can make their views known through voting and through other methods, and what possible drawbacks there are. So what we'll be dealing with initially is this idea of expert-driven policy formation and planning. This is how a lot of policy is done in cities. Most people don't have time to take part in time or expertise to take part in the planning process. And so people are appointed, we call them bureaucrats essentially, right? They're appointed, it's their job to make these plans, to consider various ends. I've just listed a few, traffic flow, economic development, but also quality of life and other ends, environmental impact. So it needn't be these sort of bad things that we usually think, like bureaucrats only taking account in traffic flow into account, or something like that. It can be other things as well. And so what they do is they use some sort of rational design process and rational policy formation process to think of the costs and benefits of various policies and plans. And the hope, using such a scientific process, using a reasoned process, is that we develop better policies, we develop better cities. And so today we'll be sort of evaluating, how possible that is, and we'll look at some examples of this taking place and how this has shaped cities. So what we'll initially look at is the sort of ideal forms of cities. We talked a little bit about this in the first week when we looked at some of the history of cities. But also there's other plans that have been very significant in the history of city planning, and so we're going to take a closer look at some of these. So one of the, it has been common actually in city planning for it to be a rational process for a long time. And so, you even had Romans, putting out street plans. They would build their buildings in a rational process, such that you would have right-of-ways where you could get, a cart down, or you could get, people pass. You need to make room for certain utilities, and you can't really do this when people are just building organically. So you have some limitations on where people can build and what they can build. And this forms the basis of a rational city plan. And so one example I'll use of an earlier sort of pre-modern city planning was Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. was built from nothing, right? There was nothing when the Constitution said there had to be this capital by the Potomac. There was very little here. There was Georgetown and there was Alexandria, but these towns are not, they're off to the side of Washington, D.C. Where Washington, D.C. now, where the Capitol is and the White House is, there was some farm fields, some swamps, really nothing to speak of, and so it had to be planned and built. So the designer hired by George Washington, in fact, was L'Enfant. He was a Frenchman, and he basically made this plan. The city, the streetscape that we know now was made from his plan. And you notice that the core, so this is the L'Enfant part of Washington, right? So when you get outside of this area, things become less coherent, but within this zone, everything is based upon his original plan. And you can see there's a lot of order here, and there's a lot of opportunity for a beautiful result. Right? So what he imagined was, at the basis of this was a grid system, right? So you have these grids, and you had 4 quadrants, right? And streets were named according to their quadrant, and you had letters and numbers, and then you had states on the diagonal. So it's a really interesting plan, and it makes navigating the city, at least in the core, extremely easy. So you can know exactly where you are based upon your address without a map, essentially. So this is very nice for a tourist or something. So and it also allows us to have certain views. So Pennsylvania Avenue is sort of famous. So originally you could see the White House easily from the Capitol. Now it's obstructed, but pretty much. But so he built in these sort of design features to make the city a desirable looking place. And you couldn't have this with an organically developing city. If they just decided, well, we're gonna plop down the Capitol and the White House and then see what things happen. You just can't get some sort of structure like this from that sort of process. So that was certainly an early example, but this sort of process of developing new cities became far more prominent after the the turn of the century in 1900. So this modernism sort of swept in many ways. So modernism and technology swept the Western world essentially, and now we saw that there are opportunities to make cities very different, and there is this desire by many to get away from the sort of dank and dirty cities that had developed in the Industrial Revolution, as we read about in the first week, and to develop new cities which would be healthy and pleasant. And one of the most dominant theorists in this way was Ebenezer Howard, and what he developed was called garden cities. So his idea was that you could have the benefits. So we can acknowledge that in the country you're lacking certain things, right? So there's not as much, you can't go to the stores easily. You have to commute to go to work. All these things. You lack the sort of niceties of city life. So his idea, and then in the town you lack the sort of the nice rural aspects, right? So you don't have green space as much. Things are dirtier. It's not as clean. His idea was to join those two together to make a community that had the benefits of both a town and a country. And so what you got out of this, so he was writing just before the 30s, and what you got out of this were these sort of plans for the initial suburbs. And a lot of these were made after Howard's sort of garden city image. And also, so that was in the 30s. You had a lot of New Deal construction, from just during the Great Depression. And new urbanism today has also used some of these ideas and brought them together. So let's look at them. So you might, it's sometimes difficult to understand why people thought these garden cities were a great idea. But you can sort of just think about this a little. Obviously, we have a certain amount of density. So if you look at these are apartments in Greenbelt, Maryland, and the idea is that you have a certain density of people, right? So you have these small, low-rise apartments, and so you have enough people, like a town, but you also have green space. And if you go to Greenbelt, it is a very green place, right? So you have lots of open space, lots of parks, and so you lack the sort of concrete effect of the city, which is very nice. And you also see this in places around DC. So the outer parts of DC, there are many green belts, right? So these are belts of green of park going through the city. So Rock Creek Park is one of them, and you'll also see this along a number of the creeks, right? So you have these parks which offer green space for the people around them, and this originates from the garden city sort of concept. And so here's sort of an overhead view of Greenbelt, Maryland, And this really is a good example of a garden city. It was built exactly at the time. It was it was a New Deal town, um, built entirely, at one time, and it takes into account all these things that Ebenezer Howard wanted. He wanted the town, right, or the luxuries of a city, the services of a city or town, and yet in a rural sort of landscape. And you can see, so here is the extent of the city, or of the town of Greenbelt. So this is Old Greenbelt, is what they call it, because there are newer parts that have not followed the same design, um, coherent design. And what you have in the middle are the various public areas. So you have a library, you have a grocery store, you have your fire department, you'll have your school. So these are very important because they're rather close to people living in the town, the city of Greenbelt. So they're able to not drive everywhere, right? So they don't need to drive everywhere. They can come to this area, or if they drive, it's a very short distance. So they needn't commute for anything. And Howard even imagined that there'd be some jobs, like there should be some amount of jobs in these communities, but they would still be within quick commuting distance to a major city where a lot of other people would have their jobs. So his vision is not this sort of bedroom community idea of a suburb, which is very common, where you have some subdivision with no stores whatsoever, and you only have large grocery stores that cater to entire regions pretty much, and everyone commutes to one place or another. What he imagined was these garden cities outside of the main city, which provided most of the services people needed. So it'd be very little commuting, and yet they were still with easy access to the city. So, and if you see new urbanism development, like so the newer stuff, which they're sort of abandoning the old idea of or the suburb from the 50s and 60s, and looking for a new sort of living environment. This is the kind of model they often use, and so this is important to keep in mind. So even though we might consider this to be good design, it's still a top-down design. It's a rationalist view. You're putting people into a certain context, and they're not able to change things organically, really, right? So that you build this structure and they come to it. And so, it's important to keep that in mind. So we need to contrast Howard's view of what cities should be like, or what the new style of development should be like, with Le Corbusier's. And now Howard had a great deal of influence in sort of pre-war England and the U.S., but Le Corbusier had far more influence afterwards. So he's probably the most famous architect in the 20th century, perhaps. And he sort of he was integral in developing the modernist movement in architecture. And so his views of cities were also extremely influential in the 40s to the 70s. And the idea was to abandon the old urban forms, these sort of more classical urban forms, in favor of a modern, and what this also meant was autocentric one. So the idea of modernism is to sort of throw aside these unnecessary artifacts from the past, right? So there's certain ways we do urban design which they thought were from the past. They didn't actually help us solve any modern problems. They didn't address the issues that we face today, and so we should get rid of them. And the sort of normal way of designing cities was one of them. So whereas with Lafont you had a very dense city. I mean, downtown Washington D.C., which is what he designed, is very dense. So his streetscape is meant for people walking, for carriages, these sorts of things. Whereas Le Corbusier was more interested in accommodating cars, right, and accommodating all the sort of so a really good place. So we could look in many different places for influences from the modernist movement. And so in 1933, there was this famous group of modernist architects who got together on a boat, essentially, bound for Athens, and they wrote up what they called, the sort of Charter of Modernism, or what has been called the Charter of Athens. And this set down the sort of principles of what modern architecture and also modern city design should be. And this was used as pretty much a blueprint for a lot of cities' planning departments, which is very strange. I mean, so the architects that they hired were often modernists to build large projects, and all of this fit together with the desire to have efficient transportation systems, dominated mostly by automobiles. The idea was that the future really was just going to be full of automobiles. So this is similar to Wright's view, Frank Lloyd Wright, who thought, this idea that we'd be taking, be walking places, far distances, taking buses, taking trains. This is, sort of old-fashioned, and he thought everyone would have a car. And this is great because people can live very far from where they need to be, and they can make certain choices that wouldn't be available to them previously. And so then you could just proceed to dismantle the dense and dirty cities. And so you end up with things like this, what you're seeing before you. This is Brasilia, which was designed, so this is the capital of Brazil, and it was designed entirely and built entirely during the modernist period. And you see a lot of cities like this I know India has a few, South America has plenty, and in some cases in the US and Europe as well. But in these places, when you see there are these opportunities for entire cities to be built via modernist principles, you really see what they're talking about. So what do we see here? Well, everything's really far apart. We have these huge expanses of green space, of brown space, these block buildings. It's impressive in certain ways. You have these huge roads. It's very easy to travel via car. It's very coherent. And there is something appealing to it, but this is sort of what Jane Jacobs was thinking about. Right? This is what she was up against when she was writing. This is the vision of the future, to design cities like this, and she thought this would be the death of urbanism. And so here's a view from the ground in Brasilia, and you can sort of see no one is around, right? There's lots of people around, sort of, but they're very far away. And it's hard to, there's some people over here, there's tons of people in the buildings, but there's no reason for the people to be out of the buildings unless they're in their car. And the people in the cars have little attachment to the people elsewhere. And what you see, so also what took place, at least in the US, was the development of a great deal of housing projects during the 50s and 60s. So these are usually what you get when you get to see modern design on a grand scale. So this is the Pruitt-Legault, I think you say, housing project in St. Louis, and it was built based on modernist principles. So you have lots of big buildings, right? They're arranged in this sort of geometric way. There's no real diversity there, right? Everything is very efficient about getting people, in a certain density in these homes, and they're all serviced well via roads and parking. And the idea, so I mean, the idea to these, and this sort of also is similar to the garden, this garden city, right? So you might imagine that these are towers in a garden. Now, this is barren, but we can imagine even if it was grass, right, and they'd have playgrounds and such. The idea was to have these towers, and this would free up a lot of space for, for just general, playgrounds, community gatherings and such. Except, it just never worked. So this is famous for being one of the biggest failures in public housing. In fact, it was so bad that it was torn down about 10 years after it was built. And what's interesting, they did a number of studies in this, about these buildings, and they had incredible crime. Most of within like 5 years, a lot of the windows were broken, and yet there were low-rise apartments nearby, in one of these neighborhoods nearby, which had very similar features. They're also public housing, and they had very low crime. And so it seemed like the design itself was causing this. And actually, what's interesting is the architect who made these later went on to design the World Trade Center in New York. So this was a legitimate architectural endeavor by rather what you might consider good modernist architect. So as we've seen, expert planning allows cities to create very coherent and well-formed plans and policies. And so without some group of experts who know what they're doing, who know how to best maximize some set of ends, it's really hard to do this. And usually it seems, where we get into problems, or planners get into problems, is either when they think they know more than they do, right? When they think that they're going to maximize some end, like for example in the last slide we looked at with the housing project in St. Louis, they were trying to maximize certain ends. They were trying to make life best for the poor who were living in that housing, but what they ended up building turned out to be terrible for that. So there were these factors they didn't understand, and actually these sort of examples have led in the 70s to a new way of looking at architectural design for housing projects, and also for any sort of large development like that. Like there's certain things you need to do to make it safe and to make these sort of projects work. And they didn't understand that at that time, but they thought that what they were doing was best. So there's that problem, and there's also the problem of maximizing the wrong ends. So when we look at plans like those by the New York planning office, or whatever the reading you read for this week, what we see is that they are trying to maximize certain ends, and actually they're probably doing it pretty well. So what they wanted to maximize was basically they wanted to keep cars out of the city of Manhattan. They wanted to put them on a highway separated from the communities within Manhattan, and in doing so increase traffic flow, right? So make traffic faster, allow people to move across Manhattan faster, and also protect pedestrians and other people within the city, and prevent bottlenecks in the actual grid system of the city's street system, because that is actually harmful for many of the neighborhoods in New York. And so they were trying to advance these ends, and those are good things to advance, you might think, but they left out these other ends when they thought of just plowing a highway through some of the most sort of interesting neighborhoods in Manhattan. You might think they would have lost a lot by doing that. And so we need to be clear about what exactly they're doing wrong. And it seems like in that case they're just leaving out certain ends that people have, and leaving out interests of people living there. And so that brings us to the second sort of the second extreme of sort of planning, And that's when it comes, it's democratic planning. It comes from the people first or their elected officials. And then experts are only consultants, essentially. So the ends and big major features of the plans are come from the citizens. You could think of them getting together in citizen groups, planning these things out, and then having some sort of expert, some sort of city planner, some sort of trained person there to guide them in the process, but not to lead them into a certain direction. So you can imagine that, but these sort of processes are these sort of decentralized processes, right, are easily interrupted, right, when, for instance, if the group sort of changes, right, so you might imagine some people lose interest and other people gain interest. You might have a complete interruption in the plan. The new people come in and say, all this stuff these people were doing was dumb, and then the plan stopped. Even though these things take years, oftentimes, and that's another problem. Usually when you have a group of people getting together who are not experts and not professionals, it takes a very long time to actually make a plan that's good and people accept, and so it might never get done. And so these sort of processes is very chaotic. It's less orderly than a centralized planning process by professionals, by experts. But you might think you have a nice direct link to people's preferences. Of course, it's susceptible to the distortions we talked about in the last lecture, in the lecture before, about both voting and people's preferences themselves. But it's still more direct. So if we think there's something there that people do have some sort of preferences, especially about what sort of places they might want to live in, it's plausible people might have preferences for those things. We do have a more direct contact with that. But you might think in the end this sort of process can't be done because it just takes the coherence out of planning, and it makes long-term planning nearly impossible. So it might be that we want to include features of both of these, expert-driven planning and democratically driven planning, and that should be our planning mode. So Jacobs presents something similar to what I'll suggest in this lecture, in the chapter that you've read for this week. She recognizes that there are very good reasons to have experts doing the planning, right? So it's very important to have people who know what they're doing in the planning process. But she thinks that when they become detached, so as she was talking about, what would end up happening in many of these meetings, right, that the experts would put on, and then have people from the community come in and voice their concerns, the decision was made before those people ever showed up, and that is troubling. So if there is no possible change that could be made from the input from the community, that seems to throw away entirely the sort of democratic features of planning. And so what Jacobs thinks we should do is, so that, one of the major problems that we miss, she thinks, is that we shouldn't be doing large-scale planning generally. So she thinks that, okay, there's certain cases like taxation, or you might think, transportation planning, like with highways and such, that should be done in a regional sort of form, because of course with transportation you need the roads to go to some other roads, right? But even in that case, it would be limited by plans by certain neighborhoods. But you might have some widespread planning, but or large area planning. But generally, planning should take place at the neighborhood level. So what she thinks of is that you really need to understand the system in which you're working. And as she was describing in chapter 1 that we read of her book, there's a certain way that cities exist, right? So there's certain dynamics in cities that are really difficult to understand by someone sitting in a planning office downtown, and she's talking about New York, which is a huge city, right? So she thinks it's not possible for that person or that group of people sitting in the planning office in wherever it is in Manhattan to understand what's going on in Brooklyn or understand what's going on, in Greenwich Village or whatever. So what she thinks is that the location of the planning should be at the neighborhood level. So you should have experts of some sorts. They should be experts generally, but they should be planning for their neighborhood and have some link to their constituency. She describes them as sort of like local mayors, right? And she wonders who these might be. They could be many different types of people. They'll often be people voted into office, but they could be people appointed. And so you could have a network of experts in a city, but the planning itself needs to take place at a neighborhood level. And then, because the most important thing to know is about that neighborhood, right? That's the most important expertise to have. This will prevent the sort of destruction of neighborhood dynamics that she finds so troubling. So, and as she talks about elsewhere in the book, we can't take what they call greenfield planning methods. Where the idea is you have this open field, right, and you just need to plan a city. This is sort of how DC was planned. You can't take those sort of planning methods and put them into a neighborhood, right? And this is often what we do. We take the suburban planning methods and insert them into existing neighborhoods, and we wonder why this is we get bad results. So she calls this catastrophic. Both catastrophic money, where a single source of money just changes all the dynamics in the neighborhood, and for the worse, and catastrophic development, where a single developer might come in or a single group at some time come in and just totally change everything and disrupt everything that was going on in the neighborhood before that. And I might suggest this might be exactly why the modernist planning did poorly in many cases, because they destroyed entire neighborhoods, destroyed entire areas, and made a new town. They wanted to make the city new, right? In a new sort of plan, a new sort of theory of what a city should be like. And in doing so, they destroyed many of the systems, the sort of systems of neighborhood, of family, of all these things that kept stability in the neighborhood. They destroyed those things. And these are the sort of methods you start to use if you might use this large-scale process. And it's just too complex to come in and change things and understand what's going to happen when you do this. And so this is the main point she's trying to make. So we might imagine that the planning process, this is sort of middle road between the two extremes, right? So there's one planning process which has the residents be the dominant group, and the other with the planners being the dominant group. You might imagine that you have a back and forth, right? So planners might make plans, and this is often what is used today. They send them to residents. They have meaningful meetings about these things, where the things are actually explained to residents. What they say actually has impact on the planners, and then the planners adjust things. And so in this way, you can have coherence, right? Because the planners are proposing things, and stability, because the planners will usually stay the same. Like a planning office won't change drastically over time, and yet you have resident input. So this might be a middle road, and this would be a constant process. And so this is one way of thinking about how we might get out of this problem. Okay, so that's the end of the sort of planning part of the course, and what we're going to talk about next, and I'm going to be sort of compacting the last 2 weeks because they do relate to each other. They sort of fall under this theme of how what should we do when we're planning or forming policies in cities, and then also in week 6 the concern is, okay, what is what is architecture? What sort of aesthetic concerns should we have? Um, should we think of what we're doing as some sort of art where we're building a city, that should have certain visual properties, or should we think of it as a functional sort of machine that serves certain purposes for us? Um, and molds our behaviors in important ways. So we'll talk about that then. But so first in week 5, which we'll get right into now, we're going to talk about gentrification, which is the change of neighborhoods, and this will go back. This is why I put it here. This will sort of go back to what we were talking about. Whose preferences should we be concerned with, and it seems like we should be concerned about some groups, right? So it seems like we shouldn't kick an entire group out of an area because it's becoming way too expensive or something. We should do something about that. We should, it seems like we should do something about that. Maybe not, but that is definitely a concern. And then also corporate dominance in cities, and whether we should help prop up local businesses and whether these serve important functions. Because remember, Jane Jacobs thinks they do. Certainly, a Walgreens in a neighborhood would not serve the same function as she thought local small businesses did, and so this is important to sort of consider. And so we'll do all those this week, and I'll get some readings up tomorrow, and then I'll have another announcement, a lecture up later this week, and I'll sort of give you an idea of where we're going from here. Okay, so I'll see you later.